It was a cold February morning in 2006 when 26-year-old Bridget Tierney learned that the valley she'd been born in had been sold out from under her. She was standing in the doorway of her grandmother's farmhouse, barefoot, on the worn pine floor, holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. The letter was tucked inside a county mailer, sandwiched between a water bill and a seed catalog, and it informed her, in language so polite it felt like a slap, that the 800 acres of open pasture land surrounding her property on 3 sides had been purchased by Monarch Ridge Estates, a luxury vineyard and event venue development. Ground would be broken in spring. The letter wished her a pleasant day. She read it twice. Then she set the mug down on the porch railing and looked out across the frost-covered meadow that ran from her fence line all the way to the low blue hills. She could see the old stone wall her grandmother had built along the western boundary, the one with wild thyme growing out of every crack. Beyond it, the land rolled open and golden, dotted with the skeletal shapes of winter oaks. It had been pasture for as long as anyone could remember. Now it belonged to someone with a corporate address in Richmond. Let me tell you about the land Bridget was trying to hold on to. It was 47 acres in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and it had been in her family for 4 generations. Her great-grandmother, a Polish immigrant named Katarzyna, had bought it in 1921, with money saved from 12 years of factory work in Baltimore. She planted the first lavender there, starch she'd carried from the old country, wrapped in damp newspaper inside a hat box. That lavender was still growing. Not the same plants, of course, but their descendants propagated and replanted decade after decade, a living thread connecting Bridget's hands to Katarzyna's. The farm produced lavender, 7 varieties of it, along with chamomile, calendula, rosemary, and a dozen other herbs that Bridget dried, blended, and sold as teas, sachets, salves, and tinctures. She also kept bees, 14 hives that worked the lavender fields and produced a honey so fragrant and particular that the few people who tasted it never forgot it. Her grandmother, Estelle Tierney, had run the operation for 50 years before a stroke took her ability to walk and, 6 months later, her life. That was 3 years ago. Bridget had been 23, fresh out of a job she hated at a marketing firm in D.C., when she'd come home for the funeral and never left. The people in town, and by town I mean the crossroads of Briar Station, with its 1 gas pump and its general store that also served as the post office, had opinions. They always did. They thought Bridget was playing farmer, a girl who'd gone off to college and come back with soft hands and a head full of ideas about artisan this and small batch that. They respected Estelle. Estelle had been one of them, tough and practical, a woman who could set a fence post and deliver a calf in the same afternoon. Bridget, in their eyes, was not Estelle. She was a girl selling soap at a roadside table. Old Mrs. Burwell at the general store said it plainly enough. "Honey, that vineyard's going to bring real money into this valley. Jobs, tourists, tax revenue. You ought to take whatever they offer and count yourself lucky." Your grandma would have understood the numbers. She was wrong about that. Estelle Tierney had understood plenty of numbers. She'd understood, for instance, that 0 was the correct amount of debt for a farm to carry. She'd understood that the number of years it took to build healthy soil could not be compressed or purchased. And she'd understood, in her quiet, unyielding way, that some numbers, the ones on a check, were not large enough to buy what they were really asking for. The gatekeeper arrived in April right on schedule. His name was Mr. Landon, and he was everything Bridget expected and a few things she didn't. He was younger than she'd imagined, maybe 40, with a quarterback's build going soft at the edges and a smile that was designed to make you feel like you were already on the same team. He drove a white SUV that looked like it had been washed that morning, and he wore a pale blue button-down with the sleeves rolled up just so, as if to say, "I'm not one of those corporate guys. I'm approachable." He stood in her driveway and looked at the lavender fields, not yet in bloom, just low mounds of silver-green foliage stretching in neat rows toward the tree line. "Miss Tierney," he said, extending his hand, "I'm so glad to finally meet you. I've heard wonderful things about your grandmother's legacy here." Bridget shook his hand. She noticed he'd done his homework. Legacy was a careful word. "I want you to know," he continued, "that Monarch Ridge values its neighbors. We're not here to disrupt. We're here to elevate the entire valley." He paused, letting that word sit. Elevate. As if the valley had been lying flat all this time, waiting for someone to come along and prop it up. "That said, I'm sure you've noticed the scope of the project. We're talking a full estate winery, an event pavilion seating 400, a boutique hotel, equestrian facilities, and, well," he gestured toward her lavender field. "The reality is, our guests will be coming here for a very particular experience, wine country, elegance. There's a certain aesthetic we need to maintain, and an herb farm, well, it creates some visual inconsistency." Visual inconsistency. Bridget let that phrase settle in her mind, like a stone dropping into still water. Her grandmother had worked this land for half a century, and this man was calling it a visual inconsistency. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Landon?" "A purchase, a very generous one." He named a figure. It was, she had to admit, more than the land was worth on paper. Enough to buy a house in town, put money in the bank, and never think about lavender again. You could relocate, start fresh somewhere less. He searched for the word. Complicated. "The farm is not for sale," Bridget said. He tilted his head slightly, the way a dog does when it hears a sound it can't identify. "I'd encourage you to take some time with that decision. Things are going to change around here, Miss Tierney." Significantly. He was not lying. The construction began in late May, and it was not gentle. The first thing they did was clear-cut the old oak grove on the western border, a stand of trees that had been there since before the Civil War. Bridget heard the chainsaws start at dawn and felt something inside her chest crack open like those trunks. The oaks had been a windbreak, and without them, the spring gusts came roaring across the open ground and straight into her lavender fields, carrying with them a fine choking dust from the construction site. Then came the grading. They reshaped the terrain with an armada of earth movers, sculpting gentle slopes for the vineyard rows, carving out a lake that would serve as a decorative centerpiece. The runoff from all that exposed soil turned the little creek that bordered Bridget's south pasture into a brown, silty mess. Her bees had relied on that creek for clean water. Now they had to fly farther, burning energy they should have been spending on the lavender. The noise was relentless. Diesel engines, backup alarms, jackhammers breaking rock for the hotel foundation. Her bees, like all honeybees, were sensitive to vibration. It disrupted their communication, the intricate waggle dances that told foragers where the best flowers were. Hives that had been productive and calm became agitated. Some began absconding altogether, whole colonies simply leaving, flying off into the woods to find peace somewhere else. In a single season, she lost 4 hives. Each one felt like a death in the family. The lavender suffered too, not from the noise directly, but from the dust and the altered drainage. Lavender demands well-drained soil. It evolved on rocky Mediterranean hillsides, and it will not tolerate wet feet. The grading had changed the water table ever so slightly, enough that the lowest rows of her oldest field, the descendants of Katarzyna's original plants, began to show signs of root rot. She spent entire days digging drainage trenches by hand, trying to redirect the water, her back aching, and her fingernails black with mud. Now, let me explain something about the knowledge Bridget carried. It was not the kind you find in books, though she had plenty of those too. It was the kind that lives in the hands, in the nose, in the timing of a gesture repeated 10,000 times. Estelle had taught her to judge lavender readiness not by a calendar, but by the precise moment when a bud, squeezed between thumb and finger, released its oil with a certain sharp, camphor-sweet bite. She'd taught her to read the bees by the sound of the hive. A healthy colony hums at a specific pitch, a contented C-sharp, that you learn to hear the way a mother hears her child's breathing in the dark. She'd taught her to blend herbs not by recipe but by intuition, adjusting ratios to match the season, the weather, the subtle shifts in potency that came with a wet spring versus a dry one. But the most important thing Estelle taught her was about resilience, not the motivational poster kind, the real kind, the quiet kind that looks like stubbornness from the outside, but is actually something much deeper. Estelle had a saying she repeated so often it was practically the family motto. The soil doesn't argue with the weather, Bridget. It just holds on and waits for the season to turn. In the chaos of that first summer, when it felt like her entire world was being torn apart by machines, Bridget went looking for answers in the one place she trusted most, Estelle's workshop. It was a small stone building behind the farmhouse, half root cellar and half laboratory, where Estelle had done her drying and blending and record-keeping for decades. The shelves were lined with jars of dried herbs, each one labeled in Estelle's precise handwriting. The workbench was scarred and stained with decades of tinctures and oils. It smelled like lavender and thyme. In a drawer beneath the bench, Bridget found what she was looking for without knowing she'd been looking for it. A set of leather-bound notebooks, not Estelle's. The handwriting was different, smaller, more cramped. They were Katarzyna's, written in a mix of Polish and English. With small, meticulous diagrams, they documented everything the old woman had learned about the land. Soil compositions, microclimates, the behavior of water through every season. And there, in a section dated 1934, Bridget found a detailed plan for what Katarzyna called a living wall. It wasn't just a row of trees. It was an engineered ecosystem. Katarzyna had designed it in response to a logging operation that had clear-cut the hills above the farm in the 1930s, exposing it to erosion and wind. The plan called for 3 layers. The outer layer, fast-growing eastern red cedar and American holly, chosen for their density and year-round foliage. The middle layer, white pine and hemlock, slow-growing but massive, capable of absorbing sound and blocking light for centuries. The inner layer, a mix of native understory, dogwood, serviceberry, spicebush, that would attract pollinators and songbirds, creating a micro-habitat that would actually benefit the farm. Katarzyna had never built it. The logging company went bankrupt in the Depression, and the forest grew back on its own. But the plan was there, perfect and patient, waiting for the generation that would need it. Bridget sat on the cold stone floor of the workshop and read every page. Outside, the machines growled. Inside, a woman who'd been dead for 60 years was handing her the answer. That fall, she spent every dollar she had. Not on lawyers, not on an engineer, not on a public relations firm. On trees. She ordered them from 3 different nurseries. Over 600 saplings, each one chosen according to Katarzyna's specifications, adapted for the specific conditions of the Shenandoah Valley. The delivery truck driver, a man named Gene who'd been hauling nursery stock for 30 years, looked at the stacks of bare root bundles and then at Bridget, standing alone in her yard with a shovel and a wheelbarrow. "You got a crew coming?" he asked. "Just me," she said. He scratched the back of his neck. "That's a lot of holes, ma'am." "I know." For the next 14 months, Bridget planted. She started before dawn, and worked until her hands couldn't grip the shovel anymore. She dug each hole to the exact depth and width Katarzyna had specified, mixed the backfill with compost from her own farm, and watered each sapling by hand from a tank she filled at the well. In the winter, the ground froze hard as iron, and she had to thaw it with bonfires before she could dig. In the summer, the heat was suffocating, and the dust from the construction site next door caked in her throat and stung her eyes. She planted in sections, buying more saplings as she could afford them, and as each section of trench was ready. She did not buy them all at once and let them sit. That was a mistake she couldn't afford. Each batch went into the ground within days of delivery, roots still damp in their burlap wrapping. It was a rolling campaign, not a single assault. The people in town watched, and they shook their heads. They saw a thin young woman, alone, digging holes in the dirt and filling them with sticks, no taller than a child. They saw the gleaming steel skeleton of the Monarch Ridge Hotel rising on the other side of the ridge, and they compared it to Bridget's pathetic little row of twigs, and they drew the obvious conclusion. "She's lost it," said Bobby Trent at the gas station. "Completely lost it. You can't fight a corporation with a garden center. There was a night. I need to tell you about this night, because it's the one that mattered most." It was January of the second year. Bridget had been planting for 10 straight days in freezing rain. Her boots were soaked through. She had a cough that wouldn't quit and a blister on her right palm that had torn open and was weeping into her glove. She was kneeling in the mud at the far end of the north field, trying to set a hemlock sapling into a hole that kept filling with water. Across the ridge, the resort's construction lights blazed like a second sunrise, turning the clouds orange. She could hear music. The construction crew had a radio going, something with a heavy beat that carried across the empty valley like a taunt. She sat back on her heels and looked at what she'd done. Hundreds of saplings, thin and fragile, bending in the wind. They looked like nothing. They looked like a joke. The resort looked like the future, enormous, gleaming, inevitable. She looked like the past, muddy, exhausted, irrelevant. For the first time since she'd started, she thought about the money. Mr. Landon's number. She could still call him. She could be warm and dry and debt-free by the end of the month. She could drive away from here and never look back. The thought was so seductive it made her physically sick. She closed her eyes and saw Estelle's hands. Not young hands, old hands, knotted and spotted, hands that had pruned 10,000 lavender plants and pulled 10,000 weeds and never, not once, reached for something easy. The soil doesn't argue with the weather, she heard her grandmother say. It just holds on. Bridget opened her eyes. She pushed the hemlock sapling into the hole. She packed the mud around its roots with her bare, bleeding hands. She stood up and moved to the next hole. Let me tell you what patience looks like, because most people have never seen it. It doesn't look heroic. It doesn't look like anything, really. It looks like a woman doing the same thing every day for years. It looks boring. It looks like failure. And then one morning, you look up, and the world has changed. The cedars grew first, as Katarzyna had predicted. Within 3 years, they formed a ragged but solid green wall, 8 feet tall and thickening every season. Behind them, the pines began to stretch upward, their soft needles filling the gaps. The hemlocks, the slowest of all, were still short, but their branches were spreading wide, creating a dense understory that trapped sound like cotton batting. Monarch Ridge opened in year 4. It was spectacular, exactly as promised. A grand stone and glass winery with tasting rooms overlooking the manufactured lake. A hotel with 92 rooms, each one with a view of the Blue Ridge. An event pavilion that hosted weddings at $15,000 a pop. Helicopters brought VIP guests from D.C. on weekends. And behind Bridget's wall of trees something remarkable was happening. The microclimate Katarzyna had designed was working. The wind was gentled. The dust was caught. The construction noise, once a jackhammer in her skull, was now a low, forgettable hum, like traffic on a distant highway. The creek, filtering through the root systems of 600 trees, began to run clear again. The bees came back. Not the lost colonies. They were gone forever, but new swarms, attracted by the sheltered flower-rich environment she'd created in the understory. Nori, dogwood, and serviceberry bloomed white in spring. Spicebush lit up golden in fall. The whole border had become a pollinator corridor, humming with life. The lavender recovered, then surpassed anything it had been before. Sheltered from wind and fed by healthier soil, the plants grew thick and vivid, their purple so deep it looked almost blue from a distance. The honey, drawing from this richer, more diverse forage, developed a complexity that was genuinely new. Notes of pine resin and wild spicebush layered beneath the familiar floral sweetness. It was, objectively, the best honey the farm had ever produced. Bridget sold her products the way she always had. A wooden table at the end of her lane, an honest-to-God honor box nailed to the post. She put out jars of honey, bundles of dried lavender, tins of her herbal salves, and small cloth sachets that smelled like a meadow you remembered from a dream. She charged fair prices. She never advertised. The first sign that the tide was turning came from an unlikely source. A woman named Caroline Ashford, a food and travel writer for a national magazine, was staying at Monarch Ridge for a weekend feature. She was the kind of writer who could make or break a restaurant with a single paragraph, and she had been invited by the resort's publicity team to write a glowing profile. The resort had given her the best suite, the full tasting menu, the private tour. She was polite about all of it. On her last morning, bored and slightly hungover from the previous night's wine dinner, she went for a walk along the gravel road that led away from the resort's manicured grounds. She noticed the tree line first. She later wrote that it was like walking through a door from one world into another. On the resort side, everything was curated, pruned, controlled. On the other side of the trees, there was a wildness that felt intentional, a kind of cultivated freedom. She followed the lane and found the farm stand. She bought a jar of honey and a tin lavender salve. She tasted the honey, standing right there on the road, dipping a finger into the jar like a child. The article appeared 6 weeks later. It was not the piece the resort had been expecting. Ashford gave Monarch Ridge its due. She called it technically flawless and an impressive feat of landscape engineering. But the second half of the article was about the honey. She called it the most honest thing I tasted in the Shenandoah Valley, and she described the salve as the kind of thing your grandmother would have made if your grandmother had been a genius. She wrote about the tree wall, the lavender fields behind it, the honor box. She wrote about the contrast between the resort's manufactured perfection and this small farm's unmanufactured truth. The last line of the article was the one people remembered. Monarch Ridge sells you a fantasy of the countryside. The farm next door is the countryside. Now, I wish I could tell you that Mr. Landon read that article and had a change of heart, that he saw the error of his ways and came to Bridget with humility. That's not how it happened. What happened was simpler and more brutal. Money. Within weeks of the article's publication, the resort's concierge was fielding requests. Guests wanted the honey. They wanted the lavender products. They wanted to know if they could visit the farm, meet the beekeeper, buy directly. The resort's gift shop, stocked with mass-produced artisan candles and wine country trinkets, suddenly felt embarrassing. Their restaurant served honey imported from New Zealand in tiny glass jars. Their spa used lavender oil from a distributor in New Jersey. Their guests had read the article. They knew what was just over the hill, and they were not impressed by the substitutes. The requests became complaints. The complaints became reviews. Beautiful property, but the food lacks soul. Everything felt manufactured. Skip the gift shop and walk down the road to the real thing. The irony of a luxury resort that can't source local honey from their literal neighbor is almost funny. It took 18 months of this before Mr. Landon drove his white SUV down Bridget's Lane for the second time. It was a different season now. Late August, the lavender in its final flush, the air so thick with fragrance you could taste it. The tree wall was 12 feet tall and dense enough to stop a deer. You could not see the resort from the farmhouse anymore. You could barely hear it. He looked different, thinner. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by something tighter, more careful. He stood by his car and waited for Bridget to come to him, which she did in her own time, after she finished tying off a row of drying bundles in the barn. "Miss Tierney," he said. "Mr. Landon, I'll get to the point. Our guests want your products. Our board wants your products. I'm here to discuss a supply arrangement." Bridget wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at him for a long moment. "I seem to recall you telling me my farm was a visual inconsistency." He had the grace to look at the ground. "The market has corrected my vocabulary." "I might be open to a conversation," she said. "My attorney will reach out." The negotiation took place the following week, not at the resort's corporate office, not on a conference call, at Bridget's kitchen table, the same scarred oak table where Estelle had kneaded bread and Katarzyna before her had rolled out pierogi dough. Bridget sat on one side with her lawyer, a methodical woman from Staunton who specialized in agricultural contracts. Mr. Landon sat on the other with two corporate attorneys who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Bridget served coffee in mismatched ceramic mugs. She did not serve anything else. The terms were not a negotiation. They were an education. Bridget's lawyer laid them out with quiet precision, and every one of them had Bridget's fingerprints. Price, retail, not wholesale, plus a seasonal premium during peak lavender harvest. She was not a factory. Her products were not commodities. If the resort wanted the authenticity their guests were demanding, they would pay the authentic price. Quantity, a fixed allotment per week, determined by what the land could sustainably produce, not by what the resort wanted to consume. Bridget would not push her bees harder or plant more acreage to meet corporate demand. The land set the pace. The resort would learn to live within it. Exclusivity, and this was the stroke that made even the corporate attorneys pause. Monarch Ridge would be Bridget's sole commercial client, and in exchange, the resort could not source lavender products or artisan honey from any other local producer. If they wanted the real thing, they got it from her and only her. No hedging, no backup suppliers, no comparable to fine alternatives. Bridget's lawyer unfolded a topographic map and spread it across the table. A red circle enclosed Bridget's property with a 1-mile buffer on all sides. "No helicopter flight paths within this boundary," the lawyer said. "No amplified music events after 9 p.m. No additional construction within the buffer zone without 90 days written notice and a formal environmental impact review. The bees are sensitive to vibration and light pollution. The lavender is sensitive to chemical drift. These are not preferences. They are operational requirements." Mr. Landon's attorneys began objecting. They cited airspace regulations, noise ordinances, property rights. They talked about what was reasonable. Bridget let them finish. Then she looked at Mr. Landon and said very quietly, "Those are my terms, all of them." He stared at her. She could see him doing the math, the bad reviews, the empty gift shop shelves, the board members who'd read the article and wanted to know why the resort couldn't serve the honey their guests were begging for. She could see him calculating the cost of her refusal versus the cost of her terms. "We'll sign," he said. "Take your time, Bridget. I'm not going anywhere." The years that followed were not dramatic. That's the thing about patience. Its rewards are quiet. The contract gave Bridget a steady income, enough to stop worrying about money for the first time since Estelle's death. She used it the way Estelle would have. She didn't expand, she reinforced. She bought 60 acres of woodland on her eastern border and placed it in a conservation easement, ensuring it could never be developed. She invested in her soil, her hives, her drying barn. She replaced the roof on the farmhouse with the same standing seam metal Estelle had always wanted but never could afford. The tree wall grew into a true forest. By its 15th year, it was 30 feet tall, a dense, layered wilderness that swallowed sound and light and gave back birdsong and clean air. The hemlocks, the patient ones, had finally come into their own, their spreading branches creating a cathedral-like canopy beneath which ferns and trillium grew in the filtered light. Deer bedded down along the edges. Hawks nested in the tallest pines. The ecosystem Katarzyna had designed on paper in 1934 was alive, breathing, self-sustaining. Monarch Ridge changed owners twice. Mr. Landon moved on to another project in another state. But the Tierney Farm supply contract, with its ironclad clauses and its conservation requirements, became a permanent feature of the resort's operations. New managers were briefed on it during their first week. Over time, the resort's marketing department, with the shamelessness that only a corporation can muster, began to actively promote the partnership. Farm-to-table honey from our neighbors at historic Tierney Farm. They printed it on the menus. They sold gift boxes in the lobby. They organized guided walks to the farm stand, which Bridget tolerated exactly twice a year on her terms, at times she chose. She had become, without ever intending to, the thing they'd tried to erase, the most valuable asset in the valley. Young farmers found their way to her, the way young people always find their way to someone who's done the thing they're trying to do. They came from all over Virginia, from the Carolinas, from as far away as Vermont and Oregon. They didn't come to learn how to scale up. They came to learn how to hold on. Bridget would walk them along the tree line, showing them the cedars she'd planted first, now thick-trunked and fragrant, and the pines that towered above them, and the understory alive with bees and butterflies and birdsong. "Everyone will tell you that bigger is better," she'd say, running her hand along the rough bark of a cedar she'd planted when it was no thicker than her thumb. "They'll tell you to modernize, to optimize, to scale. They'll tell you your way is too slow, too small, too old-fashioned. They'll wave money at you and call it opportunity." She'd stop and look back toward the farmhouse, barely visible through the trees, smoke drifting from the chimney, the lavender fields stretching beyond it, in rows so straight they looked drawn with a ruler. "But here's what I've learned. The world will always press in on you. It will always want what you have. You can't outfight it, and you can't outrun it, but you can outlast it. You can plant something that grows while you sleep. You can build something so quiet and so real that the world eventually has to come to you on your terms, asking for what only you can give." On a warm September evening, when the light was golden and the lavender was sending up its last fragrance of the season, Bridget sat on the porch with her niece, a girl of 19 with dirt under her fingernails and her great-great-grandmother's stubborn jaw. She handed her the leather notebooks, soft and dark with age, their pages dense with Katarzyna's cramped handwriting and careful diagrams. "These are yours now," Bridget said. "They know things I haven't figured out yet. Read them slow, and when you're done, go stand in the field and listen." The girl took the notebooks carefully, the way you hold something that is both very old and very alive. "What am I listening for?" she asked. Bridget smiled. You'll know when you hear it. The land always tells you what it needs. You just have to be patient enough to hear it over all the noise. The resort on the other side of the ridge was hosting a wedding that evening. If you stood in their parking lot, you could hear the band and the laughter and the clinking of expensive glasses. But on this side of the trees, there was only the hum of the last bees returning to their hives, the whisper of wind through pine needles, and the deep, unshakable quiet of a piece of ground that had been loved well enough to love back. The man in the blue shirt who came all those years ago told Bridget Tierney her farm was a visual inconsistency. He was wrong about that the way powerful people are usually wrong about small things. Completely, and with great confidence, she kept the farm. She kept her grandmother's wisdom. She kept her great-grandmother's notebooks. And in the end, it was the world, with all its money and noise and gleaming ambition, that had to rearrange itself around her, because she had the one thing it could not build, could not buy, and could not fake: something real.